I think with the last 4 presentations, the mission was accomplished of really kind of opening up the door, opening up the window from kind of hands-on or the very factual approaches to kind of airport designs, and now we've kind of left orbit, literally speaking. It was also, as Nelly said in the beginning, it's all about a change of perspective. Remember in the morning, no? That the perspective makes everything, which is a nice reference, and you offered us very broad new perspectives on the future, or kind of, it was almost like a panel for pattern recognitions of future trends, so to speak. In your case, you took it very literal, but you've probably noticed the poster of the Biennale here, no? Reporting from the front, a woman standing on top of a ladder. Do you know what that image is about? I'm asking a question. No, it's actually a picture of Maria Reiche, who was a German scientist, actually origin biologist, who got completely dedicated to the Nazca lines in Peru, you know, those famous lines in the desert. And she at one point discovered, or was fascinated by them and dedicated, I think, 50 years of her life to kind of exploring them. And at one point she just realized, I need a ladder to kind of change my perspective and kind of look down on things. And the picture was actually taken by Bruce Chatwin, who is a writer who used to work, he was an art historian, used to work for Sotheby's and looking at art. And at one point had problems with his eyes and couldn't see very well anymore. So he needed a change of perspective. And he quit his job and started traveling the world and writing about it. So that picture is from a short story of Bruce Chatwin in his book called What Am I Doing Here? So that's the question that we are asking us here as well in the last panel. Quick introduction. There's a lot of common topics amongst all of you. One I would like to stress, and maybe you can react to that one, is that obviously of the autonomy of things, which came about in a few of your discussions, and also mobility. Mobility really in the widest sense, and I'm not speaking mobility only of transportation of people, but we are looking at a globalized world in which there's all kinds of mobility happening and really affecting also our reality and our future, whether it's really the like physical mobility of people or the also the various reasons why we move. In Europe in particular, we are confronted with a huge wave of refugees. That's a form of political mobility. Then we have obviously social mobility. We have climatic mobility. Think of Katrina, which you mentioned before, where people are forced to move because of climatic reasons. Then business mobility and leisure mobility, etc. So it's an aspect that's going to affect us all very, very massively in the future. So this as a starting point, maybe you can give your spin on things from the various perspectives. And the order is up to you.
Should I go first? It's on, right? Yeah. Yeah, you know, this is the really complicated thing about predicting the future. I would say, you know, the whole aspect of, so when we talk about autonomous mobility, I find oftentimes the perspective of car manufacturers very kind of like not very forward thinking. So when you think about all these autonomous vehicles that are being proposed, you know, basically the innovation that's being praised is that you can turn the seats to one another, right? It's oftentimes there's like, oh, you can, you know, have conversations and the car drives itself, and you know, but what's really happening is that that things become autonomous, right? Because mobility is not going to be something that is exclusive to people. It will be that, you know, a washing machine can drive, right? Or like I can think pretty much about anything. It's just a matter of business model. But technically, everything could be mobile, and everything can be transportation. And I think, you know, with that said, you know, you make the point that, you know, we can save parking, but maybe we just need the place for just all the things that want to move, right? I mean, we can really imagine maybe nothing is going to stationed anymore, but therefore everything is on the move. So I feel there is something. If we want to talk about the autonomy or autonomous mobility, I think we need to really talk about the autonomy of things and what that does to space.
I think that's a good point. Not only, so the autonomy of space and also the effect that mobility will have on cities, right? So if we were to redesign cities today, knowing that we have the autonomous car that doesn't need a map, it doesn't need a physical address, it can be guided by Google Maps, for example, where you don't need like a little plaque on a building that says this is such and such address. What would that city look like? You don't really need grids, you don't need intersections, you don't need stoplights, you don't need any of that. It could just be, perhaps an open field, et cetera, et cetera. Like, so I think the advances in technology would have a profound effect on the built environment. So if we start, for example, from scratch on Mars, how would we build a city, like, from scratch with all these new kind of technologies? And I think we have to think about that now, because it's happening so quickly.
I'm kind of taking an opposite now. If everything becomes mobile, then there's no static anymore, then there's no point of moving anywhere. So there has to be also kind of a counterpart of that. I'm thinking of, if there is no order, because everything is ordered out now according to streets, we have laid out streets because we want to be mobile, but if we can move in space, there's no reason anymore to have streets or whatever, then we can completely create chaos. Like a cloud today is a chaos, because you don't need order, because there is a certain system which finds the order anyways. So that would redefine everything. So you could basically build housing, or my imagination is missing now because I'm a bit overloaded with beautiful projects in my brain. But it's kind of going to this direction of we lose order, we lose structure, and where do you start? In the end, you say, okay, let's just go to sleep and start over, but not too fast.
Maybe, do you want to react to this one?
Yeah. When I look at mobility and autonomous as a concept, I think the core truly is the human. So I think if you look at a rectangular space, you draw a line in the middle. On the left, we're talking about humanizing things. And on the right, we're talking about autonomy and mobility. So I want to just get the idea out there. When we have a lot more autonomous things that are moving around, we actually need to focus on the human experience even more. So what I did not show, I actually have 2 more slides, but Carlos was looking at me in a serious way, so I stopped. But what I really wanted to say is, when you have more mobility and more autonomous of things, then you can focus your attention on the true human experience. Because these things, we have machine learning, we have all kinds of things that already can further develop. But then the people, we are still people. We still are based on emotions and feelings and so on to grow. Therefore, the airports, the airlines, or even the city councils can focus more on better human experience.
Actually, I would like to pick up on something that you mentioned in your presentation earlier, where the kind of mixed up the alleged Henry Ford quote. No? If I had asked the people what they wanted, then they would have told me faster horses. You remember you showed that in your presentation. Supposedly they said less horse shit, but apart from that, whether he said it or not, I think that's, and I think you made a very provocative statement there, and in the context of the symposium about future of air travel, is again connecting to the subject of mobility. If it's not also for the aviation business, a very viable direction to think in, the one that you presented, or that's kind of also been fostered by the others, kind of bringing the autonomous driving or autonomous mobility into the game. And one of the, the trailblazers here again is Elon Musk with Tesla on the one hand, and now with SpaceX on the other. So there you see the broad range of really mobility and cutting edge technology pushing there. So That's another question in how far, and who mentioned this one earlier, the challenge, I think probably Nelly, the challenge that we have with the big governmental organizations or big businesses, and then the entrepreneurs that can move much more agile in the development of things. So what do you predict there for the future to come? You grab to the mic very quickly. Step in the cipher.
So I think this topic of unpredicted consequences of technology is super interesting. So, you know, when you think about the very productive relationship between city planners and automotive industries, and the very productive relationship over many, many years between the two, you know, basically the automotive industry told cities, we're gonna solve a problem, and the problem at hand was horse shit, right? So it's kind of like, you know, we're going to do kind of like a more hygienic, faster way of transportation, right? And they solved this problem, right? But then, you know, when you think about the intended consequences of technology, is like, oh yeah, I solved this problem of horse shit. But the unintended consequences is, you know, suburbia, climate change, you know, these like basically like things that we basically couldn't even predict, right? So I think sometimes it helps to, you know, also now with autonomous mobility, to think about, you know, what the unintended consequences of certain technologies might be, and just like to raise awareness. And, you know, I can see currently with the, you know, like hyper-dense cities that there is now basically a whole set of new companies that comes to the table and says, oh look, you have now you know, traffic jams and, you know, kind of like a total, you know, basically your cities are totally clogged, and now there's like a new set of companies that come to the table and say, like Cisco, Google, Siemens, and they say like, well look, we're going to make your cities just more efficient, and, you know, and, you know, we introduce software to the problem. But I want to know what are the unintended consequences of that move. And I think like it's super critical to raise this awareness and like actually think about it now. I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder where are these all electric cars probably? I think no one thought this whole thing through. It's the same that car companies came in and said we're going to solve the horse shit problem, but on the other hand, Los Angeles had a very good public transportation system until the car companies came and torn out all the rails, so, or the tire companies, I'm not entirely sure about the whole story, but in this way, so also we had discussion yesterday about artificial intelligence, and I think we have to make more aware what is an electric car, what does it mean to drive an electric car, where does this battery come from, how do you come to the substances which are in the battery, are there enough batteries there in the planet? I have no idea about all this because no one talks about these things. Everyone just says, oh yeah, it's clean, it's electro. Where does the electricity come from? From nuclear power plants, from coal? All this needs to be tackled, and right now everyone is focusing on one thing and leaving and creating a whole bubble, and it's not taken care of. And I think I urge everyone and the science and scientists, and it should be politicians actually doing this, or maybe I should go to politics. I'm not going to. To take care of these things, because for me it's unanswered questions, and I think that everyone who is involved is responsible to tackle this and not just ignore it and move on, which is not a critique now here. I'm really pleased of everything I heard here. It was really great meeting you all.
But you're raising a very good point about the kind of the backstage of innovation and development and ideas as well. As you just mentioned, where does the energy come from? Or if you look at solar panels, where does this come from? And eventually, most of the stuff needed is from mines in Latin America, and there's only a limited amount to it, and we're destroying land by kind of excavating those too. So there's always a backstory to things. That are kind of a bit under the radar when these kind of colorful images are created. And that, I guess, goes for everything. However, I think it's nonetheless important to kind of speculate in that way, and I think that that's what all of you did. And I also believe, again, in the context of this, in the symposium on the future of air travel or aerial futures, is that apart from the fact that kind of every single aspect of air travel or even the experience of air traveling is currently changing, and we saw a few things also in jury before, whether it's the vertical towers, airports, or floating airports, or whether it's clip-on cabins, or whether it's a drive-through airport, or whether it's the in-flight entertainment. There's so much happening. However, I think what helps us here is kind of try to embrace or understand the bigger picture of things. And I think that's what I've tried to do by aiming on the subject of mobility in that sense. And what can also be gained for the aviation industry by expanding their field. But regarding speculation, imagination, and future visions, I think the storytelling is very essential. I would like to talk about storytelling with you guys. Like, how do I convey this image of the future? Or how do I convey ideas? And what we've seen today, also in your presentation, in Nelly's presentation, and yours as well, that we have this very intricate relationship between science is fiction, fiction and science. How one influences the other. There's a scientific achievement made, which suddenly usually causes an avalanche of fictional works based on that scientific development. You showed earlier, and that's maybe like a game changer in the history of aviation, the Montgolfier brothers or the hot air balloon. So suddenly this is a moment where in 1783, where man for the first time like elevated above Earth. They could look down on Earth. And it's this, just the idea of it started a whole genre of fiction. This fiction eventually kind of inspired then science again. If you look at the Jules Verne stuff, eventually we made it to the moon thanks to Jules Verne, because whether it's Werner von Braun or the first rocket scientists, they knew their Jules Verne by heart. They were so inspired as a kid by a pure fiction that it made it become like science, rocket science, and then reality. So, long introduction. This interrelation, I think, is very, very key and very important in kind of in landing in the world of tomorrow. This relationship between fact and fiction, science and fiction, fiction and science, and the art of storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, those are great observations. I think as humans, we're uniquely somehow vertical or vertical oriented. We stand upright, we're bipedal. There have been even studies with pre-literate children, like children that are just entering or before they enter school. They were shown aerial maps, and without any training or education, they were able to understand what they're looking at and even identify like houses and roads and actually navigate on a photograph, like aerial photograph, which, I mean, it's pretty wild. I mean, that children have that ability. It's almost innate. You know, we fly in our dreams. Like, there's just this kind of upward, kind of vertical tendency that, I mean, it's part of why I'm interested in what I showed. But the kind of the role of the fiction or the image or the speculation, I think, is also, I value it, and that's why I do it. But I think as architects, it's something that we're trained to do. Like, we don't realize it, but we actually make fiction every day. Even when we're doing a project, we have to imagine what it's going to look like. We have to draw, we have to detail it, even though it's not there. It's basically fiction. It's on paper until it gets realized. So our training actually prepares us for, you know, that kind of speculative work. Like, we can just redirect it towards something that's, you know, there's not maybe a budget or a client or a schedule, but something else at the other end of it. But yeah.
I just want to mention a couple of things. The first is about unintended consequences. I think it's very important that we think about those things, of course, but we can never totally plot out everything. Otherwise, we will still be in our caves and we will not come out. Because of that, we still have to dream And I think you're so right, as there are many jobs is a terrible word. There are many things that people do that actually are very inspiring. They are story focused. They take people to the next space. Designers, you mentioned architects is one of those. What you do is one of those as well, as writers and so on, curators, because you have to get there before your client does. And then your clients, like in this case, the airport director, then the passengers will come. So you have to get to this space, design it, think through different things, but not all the unintended consequences, because they will come. They always will come. Yes.
Yes. I'm not suggesting at all to stay in the cave and don't do anything. I'm just saying it's when you look historically to these things, it's very interesting to what technology tries to solve, and what is it that, like, basically you need to just accept.
Then it brings other issues.
You just need to accept that you can only solve for so many things,
yes,
and the rest is just unintended. And yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's been a long day. So I would like to thank all the panelists. I would like to thank the organizers of the symposium and all the audience. Thank you very much.